name is Drew, joined by Carson as always, and we have a special guest today. Harry, how are you?
I'm really excited to be here, Drew. Carson, thank you for inviting me on. I've been watching the podcast closely on Spotify. I'm really excited to give some insight onto these issues that we can talk about today.
That's great to hear, and let's delve straight into it. So first up, we are going to talk about the new mayor of New York, Zoran Mamdani, who won the election in the last week over his rival Andrew Cuomo and also Curtis Lewa. And this is very important because this is the first ever Muslim and immigrant mayor of New York, which is the biggest city in America population-wise. And he is a democratic socialist, so obviously he's going to have different policies to the mayors before him, where democratic socialism is basically where you want to implement socialist principles into the capitalist system, or the democratic system that's already running in New York. So what do we think about this?
You'd like me to start, you're brilliant. I think it's really interesting to see the change in the dynamic of the USA with a left wing and obviously Muslim mayor coming in. Obviously in the past the US has had quite big stigma against, especially Muslims, obviously due to the 9/11 attack and also due to communism during the Cold War. And it shows a real period of change in the US political system, and it's something I'm really excited to see unfold.
Yeah, I think one thing that's quite important to touch on is, of course, Donald Trump has accused Zoran Mamdani of being a communist, right? And there is certain differences between being a democratic socialist and being a communist, which is, so obviously because of the Cold War, many Americans are kind of afraid of communism. So that's kind of one of the buzzwords that's
used.
Yeah, exactly, because it makes people fear him in a way. But democratic socialism has been implemented in places across the world. For example, Norway, or countries, and Scandinavian countries especially. And you have to say that it has worked to some extent because, well, in those countries, Norway has one of the highest GDP per capita in the whole world, one of the lowest inequalities if you look at the inequality metrics, and also has sustained economic growth as well. So clearly, democratic socialism can work, but I'm just interested to see whether it can apply to New York.
Yeah, I think if I'd like to add to that, I think obviously trying to implement it into a capitalist country like New York, like the US, where New York is obviously situated, would be quite difficult for Mamdani to do. It'd be really interesting to see how hard he sticks to his policies and whether or not he has to be more pragmatic, because obviously he's not the president of the US. Obviously this election has received so much coverage that you'd think he's being a presidential election, but it is only a mayoral election. It'd be really interesting to see what power he actually has in New York and how far he can go with his policies.
100%, and some of his policies are very interesting. So, for example, he has a policy to make all buses free, which I think is going to be quite hard to achieve, but would help with cost of living, obviously. His main aim is to drive down, to increase affordability in New York, and he's also going to do that via freezing the rent prices and building 200,000 more houses, making the minimum wage $30 by 2030, which I think is going to be very hard to do. But these are obviously all going to be able to lower this cost of living, which is the crisis that we have in New York at the moment.
Yeah, I think, you obviously touched on the free buses, right? I think this will be really interesting to see whether this can actually work. So I think 2 years ago, maybe, they tried something like this in New York. So they made the 21 free, and it probably was not a success, to be honest, because the kind of result of that was just overcrowding of the buses, and that's not very sustainable, especially if Mamdani wants to make this a long-term project and make all of the buses free. And it's also important to note, how is he going to fund these free buses? The money has to come from somewhere. Of course, his plan is to tax these big corporations or tax the rich, but this also may have other consequences. So there's actually been examples of billionaires who have left New York due to the high taxes. So there's a guy called Carl Icahn who runs Icahn Enterprises, and he left in 2022 to go to Florida. And he said that many other billionaires will probably do the same thing if taxes increase on them. So with Mamdani planning to do that in the next few years, you may see these really big investors, these really big businesses shift out of New York and move to somewhere like Florida, Miami, for different reasons.
I think Mamdani has fallen into the trap of being too populist in his electoral campaign. I think he's said lots of things which, if you're a New York citizen, you're going to feel good about a rent freeze, you're going to feel good about universal childcare for 6 weeks to 5 years old, and you're going to feel good about free buses. But then when you see those billionaires leaving, and you see where we get this money from, then you start to realise his policies unravelling. So it'd be really interesting to see how he reacts to what's happening, because obviously he has a very idealistic view of what he wants, and we'll see how he can be pragmatic going forward in this period as well.
100%, and also Trump is not going to provide him with the financial backing that he did with the other New York mayors, obviously because of the tensions between them at the moment, and that's going to make it even harder for him to fund his projects. But I do think that there is a lot about Mamdani to commend. For example, the way he won the election in terms of his appeal to the population of New York was very cool, in my opinion. I think that his use of different languages, for example, to different immigrant populations in New York, for example, he used Hindi and Spanish quite frequently to appeal to Indian and Mexicans, and that was very effective in terms of him winning over those demographics. And at the same time, he was himself an immigrant, so I think a lot of other immigrants in New York kind of felt that personal connection to Mamdani, and I think that Mamdani is accurately representing the values of immigrants and also just the working class in general, for which they would vote for.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think he's been incredibly charismatic, especially when he was debating Andrew Koh. He completely ripped him apart. And when I was watching that, I was almost in awe of the way he was speaking so eloquently. And I think that's something to really commend from someone only as young as him. He's only 34. I think he's only been in politics for about 5 years. So it's really, really good and interesting for the New York people to have someone to look up to. We're fulfilling the age-old idea of the American dream, to come as an immigrant and to be able to come to this, something which I really commend.
Yeah, no, definitely. But also, in New York, there was a lot of coverage on Mamdani's election. This wasn't the only election going on at the time. There were other state elections going on in a similar period of time. And I think the Democrats actually won the majority of those, or all of those, in fact. So this maybe shows like a shift. Maybe people are not happy with the way Trump is doing things. Of course, there's a few controversies about the things he's doing, such as his actions around immigrants. So there's been lots of videos circulating online of ICE, so Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they're basically detaining people who are believed to be illegal immigrants in a very aggressive way. And some people don't like this. When you see this online, it's seen as a very aggressive thing to do. So maybe that's another reason why. Trump is losing favor.
Yeah, I think I really agree with that. Obviously, Trump is a very controversial figure in global politics at the moment, and Mamdani's not submitted to him. He's really created a bit of a divide between the two. He's not just bowing down and submitting to Trump like lots of other global leaders are. He's really shown him a position with full force, which I really commend, to be able to stand up to the president of your country if you don't believe in what he's doing. Really important to do.
I think you can see in his speech after he took over from New York, the way that he addressed that Trump was from New York was very, very good, I think, for him. He emphasized that Trump kind of betrayed New York, and I think that's been one of his main strengths. He's been able to connect everything to New York, and that has appealed to the population especially. Obviously, he said turn the volume up very famously in his speech, saying that exactly what you're saying. He's bold, he's not afraid to take on Donald Trump, and even with the financial backing that he won't be getting from him, he still believes that he can achieve his policies, which I think is very commendable of him for sure. And also, you have to look at all of the billionaires, like for example Bill Ackman and others who funded Cuomo. I think it was in the tens of millions of dollars which Cuomo received for his campaign. Yet, despite all this, Mamdani still was victorious. That shows that it was his policies and it was the way he's going to tackle the cost of living crisis which really appealed to the New Yorkers.
Yeah, I think you just need to still wait and see whether socialism would actually work in New York. So I mentioned earlier it worked quite well in the Scandinavian countries, but they have a different sort of economic setup there compared to New York. Obviously, New York is the base for many investors in the world. It's a business base, whilst in Norway it's a bit more mining is a bit more of a prevalent industry, for example, than in New York. So whether the idea of socialism can be applied to New York successfully, I'm still not too sure about. And I think we need to wait for a couple of years and see what happens, whether the billionaires do indeed leave, because it is difficult to leave a city like New York, even with tax raises. But if they see it as the move they need to make to help increase profits, for example, they may actually decide to do that. So we need to wait and see, I think.
yeah, obviously it's still very early days for Mamdani, and he's got a lot of time to implement his policies. He's got backing from everyone in New York, and he's such a young man. And I think now, as people looking in, we can just sit back and watch the drama unfold. It's going to be a really exciting few months going forward.
Yeah, look, we can't wait to see what Mamdani is able to do in New York. This is quite big, I think, for America, but yeah, I guess we'll wait and see.
Cool, so now we'll move on to the crisis ongoing in Sudan. So there is a massive humanitarian and economic crisis going on in Sudan that hasn't been getting a lot of media coverage, and for me personally it's very sad to see what's going on there. And honestly, let me explain why it's happening. So in Sudan, you've been having a history of military coups. Since its independence in 1956, every leader has gone to power via a coup, and that's because of how powerful the army is in Sudan. And there has never been, to this day, democracy in Sudan for the entirety of its independence. And what's basically happened is you have two armed forces, one is the national army, called the SAF, and one is the RSF, which is a group of militias, Arab militias in the West part, which have banded together, and they are more like more of a terror group. And they have been fighting for power since 2019, which was the revolution of Sudan, and since then, the humanitarian crisis has increased, and it's now, you can tell us some of the stats with that.
The humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
There's been 30,000 deaths within Sudan to civilians, and there's 25 million people in need of humanitarian aid, which obviously a terrible stat here is bigger than the whole population of other places like Palestine. And ours actually, which is even worse, that 18 million people roughly have acute food insecurity, which I think the definition is the idea that it's unrecoverable in that sense when it goes to the state of being acute, which is really terrible to hear, isn't it?
Yeah.
Country.
100%. And if you consider the actual population of Sudan to be 50 million, the one you said about 25 million, that's half the population. So that's absolutely outrageous, personally. And what's been really bad is you've got foreign powers who are funding the war and making it even harder to stop. So, for example, you have the United Arab Emirates who are funding the RSF with weaponry in exchange for gold from the gold mines in Sudan, which the RSF have control of. And the constant supply of weaponry to the RSF is horrible for Sudan because they will just use more and more weaponry to incite more terror into the country. And that is why the war hasn't been resolved.
Yeah, I mean, also one of the notable things is that there's not really been much media coverage on what's happened in Sudan up until very recently. And you can argue that the reason it's happened very recently is because of social media, and people have shared it, people have started to take notice. But you have to ask whether this really ties in with Western interests, so American interests. So the reason that places like Ukraine or Palestine, for example, may have got more coverage is because the West, for example, they have more interest in that area. So obviously in Ukraine, they want to limit Russian influence, they want to limit their expansion. And in Palestine, America has close ties with Israel. America doesn't really have close ties with Sudan in any way. Sudan gained its independence from the British Empire in, I think, 1956. So, and since then, I mean, it is quite sad because Sudan has a vast amount of natural resources. It has access to the Nile, but it's been mismanaged in many ways. So, for example, they gave a lot of their gold to Dubai a few years ago, like trying to raise money, but that didn't really work. So, yeah, so the West doesn't really have many interest in that area. So, is that why they're maybe not getting as involved as they would do in Ukraine or Israel? Because also you have to argue that if the West managed to get involved and stop one of the earlier coups, it would have stopped this whole situation becoming what it is now.
Yeah, so you actually did have recently an attempt from the West to kind of get involved. You had America and Britain. They tried to enforce democracy via this provisional government or transitional government. The problem was that the heads of the armies or the armed forces that I stated before, one is called Hemeti and one's called Al-Burhan. The amount of power and wealth they have is incomparable to anyone else in the country. And it was very easy for them to kind of overthrow the prime minister that was elected in that transitional government. And so it's really hard to break the cycle of corruption that we can find in Sudan. I think maybe we have to see some kind of military intervention because it doesn't, like, these groups are using terror and military efforts to enforce their way. This is going to be very hard to stop via democracy or via kind of any ruling. So I would say maybe some international intervention needs to be done.
Largely because the Sudan are in need of such extreme measures, then you're looking at powers like the UK, you're looking at the USA, they've got domestic problems. They're not going to be concerned with the situation in Sudan. We've seen that no troops from the UK or from the US have been sent to Ukraine. There's been nothing sent to Palestine. They like to sort of back off and focus on diplomatic matters. And obviously in Sudan, that's just not going to work. So I think that's another reason why it's gained less media coverage and there's less attention going towards it, because it's simply too big a challenge for the Western democratic powers to deal with, which is really unfortunate when you've got 25 million people in need of humanitarian aid and you're just choosing to ignore it. It says a lot about the Western political state at this point in time.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, if you compare, like, if this was maybe in 1980 or 1970, maybe the West would have had more, they would have had the ability to step in. But right now, obviously, with the economic state in the UK, even, for example, with it not being as strong as a result of many other things in the last decade, you wouldn't think that the general public would be too happy if the British government started dedicating a large amount of resources to solving problems like this. So yeah, it is a very unfortunate situation, but I don't think there's really much that can be done at this point. But it needs to be solved within Sudan itself, maybe with the aid of countries from the Middle East.
I mean, I think it's going to be very hard to solve both the political problem and the humanitarian problem. They're both obviously severe. The 25 million people all need to be supplied with resources and food and everything. So, I mean, that's going to be hard in itself to get all the supplies into that country. And especially because, it's just staggering what's going on. There's been genocides in the West Darfur region that no one has talked about, which is absolutely crazy. When, the people call what's going on in Israel-Palestine genocide, if you want to look at definite genocide, that's what's going on in Sudan. I think that's unanimous for everyone. They are systematically killing everyone in the West Darfur region. In my opinion, this needs to get more coverage. It needs to have more people donating to it. You need to have more charity organizations trying to fund for this. And I mean, it's just, like, when I think about it, it's just horrible.
Yes. Our thoughts and prayers go out to anyone affected by these crises at this time. It's something really terrible for us to have to talk about, but it's something that we need to talk about. In this environment, we have the opportunity and the ability to educate ourselves on this. In Sudan, obviously slightly different, so yeah.
Okay, we'll be moving on to the last topic of the day. We'll be discussing Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, formerly known as Prince Andrew. He had his titles recently stripped with controversy surrounding him and convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Harry, what do you have to tell us about this?
Well, obviously, there's been lots of issues around Andrew throughout his life and his connection with Jeffrey Epstein. Obviously, lots of our listeners will remember his interview on Newsround with Emily Maitlis it's almost a year ago, 6 years ago, I think, next week, 16th of November 2019. And we saw then his actual persona of when he was asked about it, and it was really quite terrible to hear him basically lie to us as the public. Obviously, it's not been proven of anything, but when you see someone speak in a manner like that and lie about the fact that they don't sweat, it's just really quite embarrassing for a royal family when you have someone behave in such a manner on a BBC interview.
Yep, definitely. This is quite a significant event because the last time that someone in the royal family was stripped of their titles was Leopold Charles in 1917, who got his titles removed due to affiliation with Germany.
Yeah, he fought for Germany.
So that shows how severe this really is, considering how long ago the last removal was, and the fact that it's tied to basically treason, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, this is very significant.
Obviously, there'll be questions surrounding what Andrew's living conditions will be going forward. Obviously, he's not going to live in a palace like a prince anymore. And it's been speculated that he's going to be moved to Sandringham Palace, one of King Charles's Norfolk residences, and he's going to be living on the grounds in a house which is as yet undecided. And this raises a really prevalent issue because we've been told that King Charles is going to be paying for that, and from his personal salary, we as the British taxpayers are paying for that. And I don't think anyone listening is going to be in tune with the idea of paying someone with a connection with a paedophile financier, Jeffrey Epstein, to live a locked away life on a Norfolk estate. That's personally, from my perspective, I wouldn't want to be doing.
Yeah, I think this is obviously not good for the royal family, because the idea of a royal family in the UK right now is a very prevalent issue, whether it should exist or should not. Some people argue that it is a waste of taxpayers' money for it to go towards this family. And as you mentioned, with Andrew being given residency and having his needs taken care of by taxpayers' money, that's angered some people. So it's raised the question, should the royal family exist? Conversely, you can look at it as a sign that the royal family is a sign of stability in the UK. It's a monarch who reigns for decades, and in light of the UK's kind of like political turbulence in the last few years, with some prime ministers lasting less time than lettuce, for example, in light of that, it is a sign of stability in the UK. But if you have people within the royal family doing stuff like what Andrew has been accused of doing, it does take that notion of stability away, and it does weaken the UK's image globally.
Yeah, obviously, when you have someone like Queen Elizabeth on the throne for so long, and during that transition period, there's always the question of, should we continue with this royal family? And obviously the traction Andrew's gained since then has been quite terrible, and it's now we see what King Charles is doing, because we have to bear in mind that this is his own brother he's doing. He's grown up with Andrew his whole life.
Yeah.
He's had to strip him of his titles, which is obviously quite sad for his perspective, but it's a harsh reality we have to face if we allow people like this to continue. Obviously, Andrew will most likely be able to escape the consequences of his actions by living his life away on Sandringham estate, and that's something quite saddening to me as someone looking in, that he's not going to be brought to justice in that sense.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, if Andrew was not to be stripped of his titles, then you would be having someone who is a accused sex assaulter as a prince, and obviously that wouldn't be very good. Having ties to Jeffrey Epstein, of course, we know, convicted paedophile. This probably had to be done. I think this is probably necessary. Although, I mean, you look at Donald Trump, who's obviously got ties to Epstein as well, and you can see that he's trying to hide this away. So maybe this is going to bring some traction more towards him as well.
Yeah, I saw an article that the US Congress are asking for Andrew to give evidence on the matter, because obviously he will have some idea of what Epstein has been doing, but that's obviously not going to be very likely at all. I think King Charles is, in this sense, to use a metaphor, he's going to be locking him away in a box and forgetting he ever existed in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, Andrew was seen as a bit of a hero by the British public as well. He obviously served during the Falkland War. This is a massive fall down from, isn't it, with all these accusations. And yeah, it really cripples his image, the royal family's image. So this is a very significant moment in British history, I think.
Yeah, and we now have to see how the government reacts to this, how the monarchy reacts to this, and as we talked about earlier in our pods about Mamdani, it's a period of political change and social change we're going through, and at this point in time we just have to sit back and watch it unfold. It's a good time to be a podcaster at this point, in a sense.
Yeah, well, okay, well, I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for coming on, Harry. Very
Thank you very
insightful
much.
as always.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been great to talk about these issues. Thank you very much.
Cool.
We'll see you guys next episode.